Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Let me thank UNIBE, the University Department of Architecture, Arquivo, AAA, and of course Grupo Punta Cana. Thank you very much for enabling us to do this. I know my students at both Harvard and Syracuse would love to be here right now, and it is really a rare opportunity for any student work to get this kind of attention, let alone in such an impressive and really beautiful journal. So thank you very much for the publication. And so by way of introduction, let me just take a small step back and tell you a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know. I host a television show called Build It Bigger in the United States, but if we go to the next slide, I think in Latin America typically it's referred to as Megaconstrucciones. And on that show, I have the very lucky opportunity, and have had for the past 4 or 5 years, to literally travel all over the world, over 55 countries in the past 5 seasons, looking at some of the most complex, most unique, most sophisticated, and most fantastic architecture built all around the world. The next slide, you'll see myself, unfortunately, climbing atop Trump Tower, which is actually now the single tallest residential building in the state of Chicago at 1,357 feet tall. Let me also break and apologize to the poor soul who has to translate me in the background. I'm sorry. I'll do my best to slow down. I don't do that very well, but I will try to. But in addition to some of the adventures I've had in Chicago, I've also, next slide, had the chance to be walking on a cable atop the east span of the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, looking at what will become the new self-anchored suspension bridge they're building there. We've also had the chance, next slide, to go to Kuwait. And there we are, very sadly, hanging off the side of what is a 1,400-foot tall, twisting, incredible stone structure called the Alhambra Skyscraper. We have also, next slide, looked at bridges. This is a beautiful bridge. This is the Stonecutters Bridge in Hong Kong, the second longest cable stay bridge in the world. And part of what we do on the show is, in part, go to these places, photograph the architecture, meet the engineers, but next slide, a big part of it is also physically getting on top of these things. And again, there I stand atop one of the tallest cable stay bridges in the world in Hong Kong. And I think that sort of speaks to the spirit of what we try and do both on the show, but what we try and do academically, and you'll see that today, is part of what we've done this semester and the past semester is not sit solely in our ivory tower and study architecture and theorize ideas, but rather, thanks to the opportunity through Grupo Punta Cana, to actually get our hands dirty and physically understand that which we're proposing. Next slide. Most recently, in addition to my work on Build It Bigger or Megaconstrucciones, I also recently completed a 6-hour film, a documentary called Rising, Rebuilding Ground Zero, which for the past 3 years we've been filming at Ground Zero in New York City, chronicling the rebuilding. And next slide, each hour in the documentary looks at one of the main projects on site, from Tower 1 to the museum, the memorial pools, to the transportation hub as well. And it talks about the architecture through the design, through the people who are building it, those who are designing it, the rationale behind it, but it's fundamentally about not 9/11, but rather 9/12, a sort of forward-looking documentary that talks about how architecture can help us both to heal, but also to move forward, and also to radically reimagine our city. In other words, what do we want New York, and by extension, America, to represent? And in large part, those ideas are embedded inside the designs of the buildings at Ground Zero. But specifically today, we're here to talk about sustainability. Next slide. And my practice, and I won't go in too deep about it because this is really not about me, but rather our students, but my practice focuses primarily on small-scale, economical, ecological solutions. In other words, sustainability at a very modest scale, where my clients who don't have a great deal of money can engage in the world of sustainable design, which, generally speaking, I think many of us have experienced, can at times be removed solely for those who can afford to spend it. This is a small project we did in Michigan, which is one of the first LEED Gold certified houses in that state. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and it's essentially the way in America that we quantify how green or how sustainable a given project is. Moving on to the next slide, that's the same project as well. Next slide as well. This is another project, but generally speaking, without getting in too deep into our work, the idea behind the way we work is in fact part of how we teach, which is the modern vernacular, which is that we attempt to make something which is inherently modern, contemporary, as we are contemporary architects, but we want to embed the work that we're doing in the place in which we're building. And to do that means you have to understand from whence you're building. Where are you building? What are the conditions? What are the local architectural materials? What are the capacities of the builders? So we hope that our work is at once visually arresting, new, contemporary, but simultaneously comforting in the sense that it should feel, its DNA should feel born out of the place in which we're building. Next slide. Next slide. Next one as well. And next one. So, you know, we can talk about my work till I'm blue in the face. I'm happy to do it. But the reality is the way we work and the way we teach is born in large part to my ability to have traveled the world and seen a number of other phenomenal architects engage in large-scale architecture projects outside of their home country. In other words, what happens when Western architects travel to the Middle East, to Asia, all over the world? How do we intervene in a way that doesn't create really pastiche, postmodern interventions where we plop our ideas down coming, say, out of New York City? Or how do we find a way to work outside of our cities and at the same time build in a way that is both respectful of the place in which we're building, but at the same time projective, pushes that place? How can we be provocative and at the same time productive? So if you look at the next slide, vis-a-vis sustainability, it's a somewhat complicated issue. Because sustainable design, in America at least, in large part, is expensive. It's amazing, but we have generally applied our skills in a sort of appliqué or applied fashion, meaning you design a building as you typically have in the past, and you clip on, or you hang on, or you place on the sustainable intervention, whether it be a solar panel or a wind turbine or geothermal technologies, or next slide, in the case of this fantastic building, a beautiful double facade, which is basically it's a climate wall as they call it, two different facades, a performance wall that can move air through the building, block sun, do a whole host of amazing performative things, but it's very complicated. It requires great engineering. And we as architects or architecture students have an interesting opportunity because all of you who are in school here studying design are not necessarily mechanical engineers. You are not environmental engineers. You're designers. You're architects. And as such, your role in sustainable design is not necessarily that of someone who is supposed to propose these technologies, but rather how do we find a way to fold these ideas into our design? So how does circulation, how does program, how does orientation, how does material selection, how do all those things become imbued with a logic of sustainability having nothing to do with the technology? Because the truth is, and as we've all seen since 2008, in America at least, when the money goes, the first thing that gets plucked out of the project is your fancy solar panels. You know, it's very, for those who've been through what's called the value engineering process, and it's funny they call it that because it doesn't feel like value. It feels like they're taking what you love out of the project out. But the first things to go tend to be the things you love most, these wonderful sustainable technologies. So I think one of the devices, or dare I say the kind of tactics or strategies that we teach our students is to find ways to embed these ideas inextricably into the DNA of your design such that they're very hard to be taken out. Now, what do I mean? Next slide for a minute. So when we began our process, we don't begin by teaching our students about how to install wind turbines or how solar panels work. In a sense, they can learn that later. We're much more interested in finding out how can sustainability work in a way that's tied to culture or fashion or history or economics. This is a project in Abu Dhabi, which is the capital of the United Arab Emirates. It is the capital city whose sister city is Dubai, which has been in the papers for many, many years. And Abu Dhabi has been, in a sense, it's somewhat more quiet neighbor, although they actually have the money. And Burj Dubai is now called Burj Khalifa because the sheikh from Abu Dhabi is the one who actually had to bail them out. Now, Abu Dhabi, no, it's true. Abu Dhabi, in sort of their big coming out party, as it will, won the right to have the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which for those who follow Formula One, that's a very, very big deal. It's like for Americans, it's the Super Bowl. For them, it's the Grand Prix. So to have this event, to have this race, they built a very significant piece of architecture. They actually built a hotel called the Yaz Hotel to commemorate the event. And quite literally, next slide, it actually straddles the track. So you have two buildings pulled apart, connected by a sinuous sky bridge, under which, and you're looking at a real photograph, cars drive under it. So Formula One race cars, next slide, decelerating from 200 miles an hour, whipping around a curve, quite literally pass under and through the building. And that's amazing, and that's fantastic and interesting, and architecture as a carnival will always draw great attention and great fanfare, but that's not really what we're talking about here. When I look at that image, I don't see the car, I see a very bizarre object hanging on top of a building. Now, what's happening to that building? It's certainly not a hotel I've ever stayed in before. Next slide. Because you look at this entire two-hotel structure, and there's essentially a large, almost apparatus sort of hanging, not even touching, but floating on top of the building. And why on earth would an architect propose, let alone get the opportunity to build such a bizarre, formally lavish intervention? And when I spoke to Hani Rashid, who is the architect from the firm Asymptote, who designed this fantastic project, he said when he first landed in Abu Dhabi, he didn't want to build a crazy modern building. He wanted to find a way to build a building that was grown from Abu Dhabi. And the first thing that caught his eye when he got, not actually, hadn't even landed yet, when he was on the plane, was the clothing, the dishdasha. As you can see, the clothing that most Arab men and women wear in Abu Dhabi and all throughout the region is this long, white, flowing dishdasha. And of course, both the color, the cut, the design, and the fit of that outfit is not random, right? It's not arbitrary. It has grown for thousands of years. It has evolved out of the desert climate. Why is it white? Well, it's quite hot there, and the white helps them reflect that sun. It's not black for a reason. And why is it long and flowing as opposed to hugged tightly to the body? Well, of course, there are social and religious reasons, but that flowing robe creates a gap between the cloth and the body, which allows passive cooling to happen. Just the stack effect, the very reason why when you light a fire in a fireplace, the smoke goes up the chimney and not into your home. I know not many fires are lit here in Santo Domingo, but you can appreciate the premise, right? The idea is that through basically a pressure difference and the geometry of that cloak, they're able to have natural cooling on the body as well as reflecting that sunlight. So if wrapping the body has become a strategy born out of thousands of years of desert occupation, next slide, could wrapping a building become an appropriate way to intervene in Abu Dhabi? And in fact, that grid shell, that 5,200 individual glass panels hung on this amazing curved steel substructure is just that. Those panels have a frit pattern, small polka dots, that work to reflect the sunlight. And then that distance from the building creates that very stack effect where the building has cool air running up against it. And I've been in the hotel, you're in the brutal heat of the desert, and you touch the glass, and it's not all that hot, even without strong air conditioning. If you go to the next slide, but much like the cloak of the dishdasha, based upon the changing geometry of the building, so too does the grid shell reflect that geometry. So you have an environmental solution that takes on an incredibly poetic form. But for all of us in architecture, it's never just about an environmental intervention. We're not just here as problem solvers, right? We're architects, right? We want to do more than that. We want to create solutions. We want to create poetry at the same time. So by day, the environmental solution cools the building. Next slide. By night, something very radical happens. Those individual glass panels, each one have an LED. Next slide. So if Ferrari perhaps wins the race, the building takes on an entirely new form. This is the modern vernacular. This is a design strategy where an arresting, unique, unprecedented formal geometry is born out of an investigation of place. And despite all of the crazy, wild buildings we see rising in the Dubai landscape, there is something that the citizens of Abu Dhabi can say about this project that ties it inextricably to their home, to their place, to their culture. Next slide. We also looked at other projects, not just hotels, but also skyscrapers, because again, the kind of class that we teach, and we'll show you the work in a minute, is that it's not typological in that it's not about designing green homes or sustainable strategies, but it's methodological. It's a way to look at culture, at economics, at politics, at fashion, at sociology, and find a way for architecture to interact with that. Which gives us, number one, as architects, more relevance, frankly, because we're not coming in just as form makers, but it also allows us to insert our sustainable ideas outside of pure technology, getting back to those ideas of solar panels. So this is a fascinating building. This is called the Al Hamra Tower in Kuwait City, and it was proposed not but weeks after Saddam Hussein was finally killed during the Second Iraq War, which is a moment for Kuwaitis, at least, of true liberation. This was their moment to say, we are finally free. Saddam is not going to reinvade us. And to celebrate that, we're going to build a building. And they told the architects, quite fascinatingly, they said, we don't want the tallest building in the world. We want a desert skyscraper. We want a building that is born from the desert. It's a fairly complicated program for an architect. What does that mean to build a desert skyscraper? Next slide. Well, the architects looked at the site, and that, is this a laser? Yes? Anyway, can you guys see that? Yep. So that's the site right there. To the north, beautiful views of the Persian Gulf, very open, of course, very cool, non-direct sun. And to the south, somewhat unattractive urban landscape, and of course, the brutal southern heat that comes in any city, but really especially in Kuwait City. The southern heat is so brutal that almost all office space is rendered useless either by obscene amounts of air conditioning or having the drapes down, the blinds down, such that you have no view. So this is the challenge they have before them. Next slide. So their response is one of fairly reasonable, simple response. Can I have the next slide? They said, well, on the north side of the building, facing the beautiful Persian Gulf, we'll have amazing, large, open, curved glass to give people that great view and take advantage of that cool, non-direct sun. And on the south side of the building, we're going to do something very, very different. Now, what did they do? Next slide. They did that. Something incredibly bizarre looking, something that I imagine most developers, if you said, for 25% of your office space, I'm going to have no windows, solid concrete, your developer would go crazy. So how is it they could justify this incredibly seemingly arbitrary, willful, and bizarre facade on the south side of the building? Next slide. Well, they did something fairly straightforward, as we all tend to do, and I hope we all do, is we look at the path of the sun, because no matter where you are in the world, it tends to do the exact same thing. In the morning, it gets up in the east, it rises in the midday to the south, where it's at its very, very highest, and then it slowly sets to the west, as it always does, leaving the north side of the building completely untouched by direct sunlight. And the good news is that happens every day, all year. So the architect said, okay, next slide, let's look at our building. Let's say the eastern sun in the morning at about 9 in the morning, it renders this part of the real estate almost useless. Remove the real estate. By about 11:30 in the afternoon, this part of the building is getting abused by the sun. Remove it. By about 1 in the afternoon, this part of the building's in trouble. Get rid of it. 2:30 in the afternoon, gone. By about 4:30, remove it. So they said if you track the sun and you optimize the space by saying when is it good, when is it bad, and literally remove the real estate that they deem to be simply too hot, next slide, you get that. Next slide. Next slide. You get a building whose south facade is literally twisting in the sun like solar blockers optimized all year to make sure that this office space is as comfortable as possible. And the moment it becomes uncomfortable, it becomes concrete. But what's most fascinating for me geometrically, next slide, is that you end up with this. You end up with a formal resolution, a curve that looks like it was done by an artist on a whim, the most incredible exaggerated curve, but is born out of a very, very specific, local, and economically organized solution, right? This is a commercial real estate developer who is putting these ideas of an economic strategy filtered through an ecological logic based upon a desire to create something that's nationalistic, a desert tower. So the geometry of the building is of Kuwait, it's of its place. Next slide. What I find most fascinating too, and this is where the layers of what sustainable design can mean are never ending. So they found their geometry of their place, that's wonderful, but what of the cladding? What about the material? Well, they decided to wrap the concrete here with large limestone panels, local to the region, acts as a thermal load which will absorb that solar radiation. That's fantastic. But if you're putting straight limestone here, what do you do here? Well, the solution was, like many, simple, local, and reasonable. Next slide. They took a piece of limestone and shattered it, and shattered those individual pieces, glued them to a membrane, and that membrane, as you can imagine, can now bend and twist in all oblique directions and can be physically applied to these crazy curves. Next slide. And there the gentlemen are whose jobs it is, amazingly, to sit on this incredible curve, next slide, and apply, in some cases, in some very, very precarious situations, apply that stone. Next slide. We had the opportunity to actually physically visit them and see how they do it. And quite literally, these gentlemen go to work every day by getting into a bucket. Next slide. That bucket is attached to a crane at 1,400 feet above your head. Next slide. And then you go for a ride. This is that Willy Wonka elevator that goes in all directions. Next slide. And if you kind of look closely, next slide, you can see where we are. It gives you a sense of perspective. We're very, very small there in the picture. Next slide. Next slide. It's a horrible trip. They literally slide you in. Next slide. And then some poor man grabs you and says, "Come on, jump over." And next slide. And you really don't want to do that because that just doesn't look safe. Next slide. That's me pretending not to be scared. But I want to point out, before you judge me for displaying my emotions, when I look down, next slide, this is what I was looking at. So, let's be fair. Now, I actually don't have an image of us jumping over, because it's one of those moments in life where it's so dangerous that you'll just let Twitter and Facebook go and you'll just climb over. Next slide. But what's fascinating is look at the methodology. It is an incredibly simple process. This is a process that in the Middle East they've been doing for thousands and thousands of years. Applying a mortar base, taking individual stone pieces, making a mosaic tile. Essentially, they're using a technology, a building technology, that they've known for thousands of years. They're cladding a form that they've developed using amazing new technology, but that is very much representative or indexing or marking in the sky the path of the Kuwaiti sun. Next slide. So the building itself, unlike many egocentric, hubristic, wild buildings you'll see in places like Dubai, buildings like that are very much born of their place, both in terms of their geometry, their logic, their material application as well. So for us in the studio, we wanted this to be our lens. This was the focus that we, next slide, brought to Punta Cana. We wanted to come here and understand how to intervene, not bring with us fancy modern buildings and very sophisticated environmental technology, but we wanted to understand the history, the logic, the technology, the climate, the people, the economics of this place, the mission of Punta Cana, and then find a way to intervene, to propose something, both as a provocation to offer a set of new ideas to Grupo Punta Cana, but at the same time to have our students understand what it means to build in an area where they actually are doing some sustainable development that is in some ways much more progressive than what we have in America. Because one of the reasons, and I have to credit Jake Keel, an old friend of mine for many years, the reason the studio exists in large part is that we sat one day in New York talking that our respective careers, we were friends from college, had gone in two different directions. Myself in television and architecture, and Jake, now the director of the foundation and sustainable development. But yet both of us were trying to find ways to bring these ideas into practice in different projects in our career. And the idea of being able to bring students to a place in Punta Cana that has such a fascinating history, to have 10, 15 students experience the place and almost like a think tank really, experience, do research, and come up with a set of solutions would be a fantastic idea. And thankfully we have the support to do it, and it's been incredible for the past 2 years. But to give you a sense of what we tried to accomplish, next slide. Now we began with the really, as Don Frank articulated, the really humble and really amazing 30-plus year history of the evolution of the site on the east side of the island. Next slide. Understanding, just looking at even the urban planning of it, seeing the small casitas that they had on the beach when, as Don Frank said, there wasn't money to build a great deal of things in the beginning, but understanding how even across the body of the site, as you look at the urban design, as you move across the beach, you can see the ideas evolve as resources increased over time. Next slide. We wanted to understand the importance of some of the infrastructure projects. Next slide. Most specifically, the construction of the airport and how that changed the dynamics of the area. But what we learned in our time there, in particular, is that there's a very fascinating relationship between the economic development of the tourist site and the development of workforce housing and a community adjacent to the development. So you have a very, very rare situation where the fate of the tourist development, according to Punta Cana, Grupo Punta Cana, is tied to the economic, educational, and well-being of the surrounding community. That's a very, very different strategy than you find in many tourist developments. Next slide. So finding out how they were intervening in the community, building a school, looking at the sustainability center. Next slide. Understanding, having the students visit the clinic. Next slide. Seeing it in action, understanding how this marriage works between designing not closed-door developments, but rather finding a way that building in these communities, when people come to visit this resort in particular, they're not coming to any other place in the world. I know Don Frank has told us on many occasions, our students had to understand that when folks came off the plane, they do when you land in the airport in Punta Cana, but when we'd come to this housing development that we were designing, they would have to know that they were in Punta Cana. And so what did that mean? So for our students, that week we spend, those 10 days here, meeting with folks like Oscar Lambert, Diana Dalmasi, amazing urban planners, many of Jake's colleagues, the idea was to also understand what does it actually mean to be visiting this in the Dominican Republic, but specifically this development. Next slide. Some of the agricultural work they were doing. I mean, there's all this amazing organic farming that Jake is organizing. How could that become a part of the architecture? How could local farming? How could commerce play into how the architecture was working? We didn't just want to build fancy houses or show that we could design pretty things. Next slide. Jake is also responsible for setting up, I believe, the first in the country. Is that right? One of the first recycling centers, also dealing with the inordinate amount of material that comes off the planes given the vast amount of traffic at the airport. So how do our students understand how that functions and how it relates to the community in Punta Cana? Next slide. And there's Jake looking ever so ecological. We also wanted to understand the natural resources, because in the end of the day, this is in fact why people are here. And our ability to build in Punta Cana in such a way where we could emphasize or fetishize or take advantage of what's there becomes a part of the process. Next slide as well, and that is all the more the case with the lagoons you have in Punta Cana. Those who've not seen them, they're really quite amazing. So the students were then charged to come here, spend time, go back, design, and ultimately present our work back to our sponsors, our developers, Don Frank and his development team, both architects, planners, and developers. But what I also want to emphasize is that there were real constraints as well. In the 2 years we did this, there were two different properties we looked at, as Don Frank said. One is a beachfront property. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. But one was a beachfront property, one was an inland property. But in both cases, the development side gave us density requirements. In other words, the students had to grapple with the issue of density, with the issue of a mix of housing types, be they studios, multifamily, 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. So we weren't simply left on our own. Students could choose to push and pull, ignore some of the constraints in service of other ideas, but fundamentally, we were still working inside of a set of real constraints that could offer, we hope, both our students something to fall back against, but also let our work have real resonance, ultimately, for Grupo Punta Cana. Because if we come back with a series of 15 beautiful sculptures, I don't think anybody really benefits from that. But getting beyond the infrastructure of Punta Cana, we also look at the architecture, of course. Next slide. The organization of the houses, because our studio is actually a twofold studio. The students worked in pairs initially doing urban design, working at a very large scale at these two different pieces of land. And then at the second half of the semester, the students would split apart. Then each one would take a small portion of their urban design to then realize. So how the houses were organized at, say, a block scale or a community scale was part one of the exercise. Next slide. Next slide as well. So you have a very interesting and rich and a really complicated architectural history, even living within the community of Punta Cana. You have work as inspired by Oscar de la Renta, some beautiful neoclassical work. But at the same time, on the same block, next slide, you have the really incredible and surprising work of Oscar Imbert, houses that I tend to think of as breathing houses, next slide, that are at the same time revisionist, bringing back some ancient language from the Dominican Republic, but also reimagining it in a very modern way. Next slide. The issues of climate, you know, which rooms were sealed, which rooms weren't. These for us as American designers or New York designers certainly are things we don't necessarily understand. You know, the fact that air conditioning is not a totalizing thing, or that the envelope, how you wrap a building, is a word that is not necessarily understood the same in the Dominican Republic as it is in America. Next slide. And what an interior space represents, what is inside and what is out, is also something that for us is a whole new experience that in large part for us as designers, you have to walk the space, you have to feel the breeze, you have to understand how those houses work to attempt to even be in dialogue with this kind of architecture. Next slide. But we also wanted them to understand building technologies. If they want to propose wild, geometric, for those architects here, ruled surfaces of thatch, they have to understand how thatch is attached. What is the superstructure? So we, in fact, got students up on makeshift roofs, building and learning the different ways in which thatch is applied. In fact, I remember we had it was a funny moment. We'd built a makeshift roof, and I had like 10 Harvard students, each with machetes in hand, whacking away at some thatch, knowing that the lawyers at Harvard were not going to be pleased with what we were doing. But they got their hands dirty. I mean, they had to understand that if they're going to propose unique, interesting geometries thanks to our fancy computers, they have to own up to the fact that someone's got to build it, and that person building it is there in Punta Cana, and they're meeting that person firsthand. Next slide. Yeah, not something just like that, basically having a makeshift roof built for students to apply the thatch. So they had this experience here where they got to, again, taste, feel, understand, get a sense of the goals of Punta Cana, and then we went back to our freezing cold places, respectively, in Cambridge and Syracuse. And it's ironic that I picked two universities whose winters are absolutely brutal. And it's always funny, when I give a presentation at Syracuse to invite the students to take my course, I give this whole speech and I just leave a slide up of Syracuse in the winter and remind them that part of the trip is to physically come to the Dominican Republic. And every year my course is oversubscribed by a very large margin. So what I want to do now is to give you a little bit of a taste, a small taste of some of the work. And you can see the work in the publication. You can see it online as well. So I don't want to dive too deep into it per se, but I want to give you a sense of what came out of it. So next slide, please. So yeah, finally, ultimately, we had to get down to brass tacks and actually design housing, both at the urban scale and at the domestic scale. Next slide. Our first project for the Harvard University students took place here. And it's a tiny piece of land right here, a beautiful piece of land called Playa Serena, which I know Don Frank has described as really the kind of the last jewel that's been left untouched in Punta Cana, and has been left so for since its inception, right, from 30 plus years ago. And so the consideration of how to finally touch this piece of land was a huge and fascinating discussion, both in terms of the overall site circulation, how does this housing relate to the forthcoming development across the road, to the clubhouse that's over here, and to the housing to the north. So we had the urban issues, but we also had, next slide, of course, the issues to take place on that site. So it was very much a studio that was based upon the real kind of intensity of having longitudinal thin site that's on the water. How do you deal with the housing? How do you deal with the density? How do you deal with that one very different facade of water versus vegetation behind you? So in that respect, it was a challenge in terms of the view, right, in terms of the ocean. Next slide. The next year, we challenged our students to something very, very different. We chose, as Don Frank said, Hacienda, which is a very large inland development across the road, not on the water, whose whole logic is actually revolving around golf. So a very, very different set of ideas, and our students had to grapple with the reality of the geometry of the golf course, the way in which it works, who plays it, what are the amenities, how does proximity to the course help you, how does the geometry, even the topography of this very, very thoughtfully sculpted landscape relate to the architecture, and can it relate? Is there a way to actually have more than just a house with a door walking out to the green? And so we had, what's been great about this experience each semester is the challenges, while the culture is the same, obviously, the architectural challenges have been varied and very different. So let's look at a little bit of work right now. Next slide. This is a project, so this is Hacienda, excuse me, this is the project itself. So this is the road right here, the beach is to my right, and this is just the beginnings of the development being built right now. The course, I believe this is the ninth, is that the ninth hole? If I'm right, I'm very impressed. And there's a water piece right there. So next slide. So this is a piece of work from two students from the Harvard program, and I want to emphasize this is a landscape architect and an urban designer partnering together. One of the other things we tried to emphasize is that we wanted to, whenever we could, to get landscape architects, get urban designers into the program and pair them up, because we're working in pairs for the first 2 months or so. It's a really interesting opportunity for collaboration. Now these students, to give you just, this is Playa Serena, this is the water right here, this is the beachfront right here. And these students took on a very, very unique and interesting idea, which is to locate the houses perpendicular to the water, which is really atypical or quite unusual for typical beachfront development. And in doing so, they brought the water in a series of brackish water pools or saltwater pools on either side of the housing, creating a kind of a personal water amenity. But what's interesting, getting back to the idea of the modern vernacular, how they wanted to understand the place and how it relates to the architecture, they said, as each of the homes are of course the same, and most developer multifamily housing developments tend to be, you have architecture that's generally similar, as you move back away from the water, something happens. Next slide. You end up with a very dense arrangement of housing, the water being here, and the housing, the water's to my right, and the housing is really quite dense. One house next to the other house. They're oriented for views out, but there's an issue of privacy. And so the solution the students came up with to deal with this alternative aggregation of housing, next slide, is a green wall. And so between the houses, if you're looking at the water this way, they developed this active, self-irrigating vegetative wall that would act as a barrier between the back of one house and the view from another house. But where things for me get very interesting is how they calibrate the design of this wall over multiple units. What do I mean? Next slide. Next slide. So the wall, as it runs in the back of the house, has a series of pitches to it to allow it to irrigate itself naturally. And here you can see a small detail of how it will hold the vegetation. Next slide. But what's most fascinating for me is they said, if you look at the salt content in the air of the green wall, it will be higher next to the water and will be lower as you progressively move away from the water. So the vegetation, the density, the type of things that will grow will differ in each house progressively as you move away from the water. So they calibrated their green wall, as you can see, to have obviously a certain thicker, denser, more robust vegetation with certain local flora and fauna that will succeed there, and different vegetation as you approach the water. Their idea being that in a similar architectural situation where you have houses that developers will build the same, you can find a way to create difference. Not just difference in color or look or style, but a performative difference. Different density, different perfume, different look of the vegetation that would not just give a coating or a kind of a style to the houses, but will actually give you a sense where you as a user, as you experience this place, will understand, oh, as I move towards the water, something is happening with the vegetation. Your own experience of the architecture is, as we would say, pedagogical, right? You as a user learn something about the place by virtue of the way that the vegetation changes as you move towards the water. Next slide. And they followed that same logic up with the materials as well. Using that ipe wood, they had an idea of having unsealed wood, so the way in which the wood would deteriorate would also be different based upon its proximity, giving these very similar houses a sense of texture and location. It was a really interesting project, and I think a very successful one for them. Next slide. This is a project from one of the Syracuse students looking at Hacienda, and for him, apart from just dealing with the overall aggregation and density, taking on the theme of the water elements that exist on a golf course, was also about the courtyard housing typology, a fairly common one you see in Punta Cana, houses that are backing onto each other that are quite dense. Next slide. And investigating this typology, next slide, something very fascinating came out of this, and this is something the student titled, and I don't even know if this exists as a term, but solar optimization. So he said, basically, if you have 4 homes who are essentially the same, one's a 3-bedroom, one's a 2-bedroom, but the requirements are the same. In other words, bedrooms should face east, or sunrooms should have double exposure, and so on and so forth. If you give the same requirements to the same rooms, but the rooms are located in different places around the path of the sun, then these similar houses have to start to push and pull and morph. And he gave himself essentially a solar strategy to adjust otherwise similar housing. Next slide. And in coming up with a series of different typologies, he was also very inspired by the work of Oscar Limber and looking at ways to think about the geometry of thatch somewhat differently. Whereas in Oscar's houses, you tend to find an overarching canopy strategy. They were interested in looking at a kind of a wrapping strategy that would develop courtyards. Next slide. They also looked at the building technology. You'll see many, many homes in Punta Cana are built with concrete CMU blocks, right, the concrete blocks. Well, how can a staggered arrangement of blocks create an opportunity for air passage or light? Next slide. This student actually calibrated different requirements of privacy based upon different bedrooms and then applied that to create different patterning. So while the houses would have a similar language to their shape, the actual program was subtly, what's happening inside the house was subtly coded in the facade. Next slide. Here's one of the strategies for the courtyard houses. Next slide. Next slide. And then here came the full idea with the CMU, the rooms, the substructure, and then creating frames for the thatch. Next slide. And you can see here the realization of some of that. And what was interesting to this student was to think about the language of the thatch as a wrapper on the building and how it would create pathways as you'd move through these courtyard housing from hole to hole on the golf course. Next slide. Thinking about the overarching courtyard elevations. Next slide. And there's an example of one of them there. Next slide. Next slide. Should just give you a taste of this. Next slide. Next slide. It was also, for this student, it was also quite fantastic. One of the great things about this collaboration is that Oscar Limber, really the father of a lot of this work in Punta Cana, was able to be with us in Syracuse at the final review. And you can imagine for a student how great and anxiety-provoking that is to have the person there on your review to whose work you're very influenced by. So that was a great opportunity. Next slide. Next slide. And lastly, I want to show you another project from Syracuse, but a different scale altogether for students who want to take on the issue of multifamily housing, to think about the hotel, because Punta Cana has both single-family homes, multifamily housing, as well as traditional double-loaded corridor bar building hotels. Next slide. And these students, again, were looking at, hopefully coming at this from a slightly different perspective of what it means to be contextual or site-specific. These students were very interested in the caliche stone. Because if you go around the houses in Punta Cana, that stone, the caliche, is used for a whole host of different things, both cooling in some ways, lighting in others, privacy fences, texture. This stone is really prevalent in many, many different ways. And these students were very interested in the porosity, in the way in which air and light moves through the stone. And they realized in looking at many, many different pieces, it never goes straight through, right? It's a kind of a non-direct porosity. It goes in and out of different ways. That's why the lighting through these things is so beautiful, almost like a stone Japanese lantern. So they said the way in which light and air move through the caliche stone, could that become a logic for potentially organizing how light and air moves through a hotel? And so they said, looking at the next slide, they said taking the typical arrangement of a double-loaded corridor, hotel rooms on either side of a corridor with a public space and elevators, what if we begin to mix in that kind of porosity, that same porosity they found in the caliche stone? What happens if that begins to infiltrate and transform a hotel bar? Next. And what happens if that becomes three-dimensional? How do you understand the way in which openings can go in, up, and around, and think about how that can reimagine itself architecturally? Next slide. And in fact, the beauty of this kind of project is that because there are real density requirements and hotel room counts, these ideas have to then get tested against the reality of making a functional hotel with proper egress and the appropriate room count. Next slide. And that means really working through the plans. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And the investigation was fascinating because when working with this kind of work in 3 dimensions, next slide, you can see the kind of punctures that happen, things that are atrium, skylight, opening, wall, window, all blend into one spatial experience. Next slide. Here, moments like these are quite fascinating. Next slide. And how that works on a facade, how public spaces interact with the private spaces and how it ultimately creates the exterior of the building. Next slide. Next slide. And really grappling with that interior space. Next slide. And the reality was fascinating. Certainly, again, a provocation for sure, but again, a kind of an arresting formal form whose logic, whose origin, whose DNA is of the stone of the place, right? The very geology, quite literally what Punta Cana is built on. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And then the interior spaces become whole other opportunities for consideration. But the implication of what happens when you transform this idea into 3 dimensions, when skylight, puncture, wall, facade, courtyard all come together. Next slide. You know, the kind of the redefinition of what the hallway is in a typical hotel becomes really a fascinating site for conversation. Next slide. Let alone what the building does at night. And you know, I can go on and on with student projects, but I want to kind of leave some mystery for the book itself. But in closing, I just want to say that I think the kind of work that we got out of these students, some of it's great, some of it's crazy, some of it's reasonable, some of it's not great, like any studio, like any architecture class. But I think all of us were really changed about how we want to think about education and how we want to think about being architects and think about what it means to build sustainably in a place and to understand what the word context means and what the word site means. And hopefully our students, and I think they did, left with a much more 3-dimensional understanding of what it means to respond to a place, to a style, to a culture, to a form, and to a climate. And I hope in the end sustainability for our students represents something much more complicated than lowering the carbon footprint of a building, which is certainly important. But I hope, especially in these more complicated economic times, we can find ways to make sustainability really, let it infiltrate every aspect of how we design and how we build, so that in the end there isn't really a difference between a building and a green building, but rather it's just a way to design and a way to think differently. So with that, let me once again thank our sponsors, Grupo Punta Cana, thank AAA, and thank the School of Architecture for having me. It's been a real honor. My students would have loved to have been here, so thank you very much. Muchas gracias.